researcher and interdisciplinary artist working across performance, film, and interactive and immersive media. Rob is currently a teaching fellow in cultural and creative industries at the University of Leeds. Before, they were a research fellow with the British Film Institute, as well as a lecturer at the University of the West of England. In 2022, Rob completed a PhD on employing augmented reality for interactive documentary storytelling. And the thesis was entitled "Through the Wardrobe, Exploring the Potential of Headset Augmented Reality to Provide a Third Space Immersive Media Experience." And part of that thesis was also an installation under the same title, "Through the Roof." And this installation also toured internationally between 2019 and 2022. And their presentation today is entitled "Making Meaning Through the Body, Understanding Interactive Documentary Audiences in Physical and Social Context." And it will deal with the different ways of how audiences use their bodies to impact pace and narrative and to make meaning.
Okay. Just trying to maximize this without taking over the whole screen. Okay, so I'll be building a little bit on Cornelia's thoughts on, particularly on in-place interaction, and pulling in some of the themes and concepts that we had yesterday, some from William and throughout the day. I'm also, starting this with a bit from Kate Nash, and really thinking through a bit of some of the scholarship as well as the audiences and my own perspective as a maker. In Kate Nash's recent book from 2022 on interactive documentary, she remarks how, despite shifting emphasis on from viewer of linear media to the user of interactive formats, scholars have tended to shy away from empirical studies of audiences. This, she analyzes as the result of the complexity of audience research and the lingering propensity of scholars to privilege textual analysis. So we as researchers focus more on what we think or what a maker says an interactive documentary is than how audiences in reality make sense of the work. It's easy to focus on the content and digital interfaces and to forget the physical and social context of the audience. Of course, interactive documentary content is not consumed in some disembodied vacuum. The cultural or geographic context of the audience, the physical environment, the type of device, the ease of layout and interaction design all impact how audiences engage with and make meaning in interactive documentaries. Today I'll first examine some of the scholarship on the role of the body of the audience in making meaning. Then I'll focus on some of the work with audiences, including some of my own audience research. What happens when we as scholars turn our gaze to the audience and the myriad variables that shape how they navigate and make meaning in the work. Finally, I think like others here, I wear many hats. I research and teach interactive and immersive formats for media, but I'm also a practitioner. So I made my first docs for web platforms in 2007 and started exploring affordances of interactivity as new platforms were emerging online. So I've been making interactive and participatory work ever since then, and I'll be drawing on some of my own perspectives as a maker. There we go. This is an image from Through the Wardrobe, from a piece that toured for a good few years, even in the pandemic when we could get it to tour. This was when it went to the Goethe Institute in China. I had to pack everything up into a suitcase and ship it off to Beijing and give them instructions over Zoom how to set up this work. You can see the kind of some of the physical elements that have been traveling around the world. Since the first interactive documentary works, we could say 45-ish years ago, the field has helped redefine this relationship of documentary audience, media, and maker. Scholars often acknowledge the role of the audience in actively arranging and remixing the story, but observations of audience behavior and context are left as anecdotal or background information. There is some literature on user testing and the iterative process of creating a work. Makers assemble test audiences, and depending on their preferred iterative design methods, they may test variables with study participants. Often it's a sort of A/B testing. Maker Ramona Pringle, in the 2017 iDocs tome, writes about the process of testing and iterating required for interactive formats. There's concept testing to ensure that the project is engaging or entertaining. Then there's pre-production, development, prototype development, production, and continuous testing. So it's this constant iterative process when making an interactive work. She writes, the user is the creator's silent collaborator, the one who will bring the interactive experience to life once it is released to the public, and testing brings that user into the design process. Now, Pringle notes how makers in the testing phase should focus on in the interface design and the device, and how that ought to not hinder the flow for the audience. But she stops at the release of it going out into the wild. So what about these studies of audiences after an interactive documentary is live? How should scholars examine the role of the body and the physical context of audiences in experience in interactive documentaries? So we saw yesterday there were some mentions of controlled lab settings for VR. For well over a decade now, we've seen psychologists and computer scientists bringing interactive works into these controlled settings to test the reactions of participants. This went from web docs like Bear 71 and Fort McMoney. These were done in kind of controlled audience experiments, and VR works such as Machine to Be Another, Clouds Over Cedra, and The Waiting Room. They've all gone through these controlled environmental tests. But returning to our critique yesterday on Bailenson and Slater, these audience tests may be useful or verifiable within a lab environment, but they're not always useful for behaviors in the wild, shall we say, where there are far more stimuli and distractions. When you're in the kind of the neutral space, supposedly, of a lab environment. Does that really reflect when you have screaming kids and the smell of burnt toast and all sorts of noise around you if you're trying to do something at home? It's not to say that we should discard all lab settings or all lab tests, but it's just worth considering all these factors that are not included in those. We can also look at some studies that have been done in festivals and galleries. There's been some scholarship on some of the best practices and on the ecosystem for film festival showcases, but little empirical research on how these audiences are kind of navigating their way through works. Our own William Riccio here led a team at the 2019 IDFA Lab investigating how the audience find their way through a story in immersive works. And they had 378 participants take part, and the scope of this research was more theoretical, but really interesting. And it looked at this intersection of narrative psychology and immersive media formats, to quote your blog post on Immerse. But the physical process and the setting of the works was not the focus. So there's some work happening in this area, but not a whole lot focusing on the physical process. So if we were to look at studies within film exhibitions, there's also another thing to consider, which is that, echoing past critiques, film festivals create automatic barriers to new audiences. And this shapes who takes part in these empirical studies. So we might say, oh, we did an empirical study of lots of people going through this piece physically, but what are these barriers? And we can look at the particular levels of capital culture, or cultural capital required to understand the festival ecosystem. So this eliminates many potential novice attendees who might not have the means to visit these places, don't understand these festivals, or don't feel welcome in these kind of cultural spaces. So you're building up an exclusive club. The particular devices and formats also might not be accessible for those with vision or hearing impairments or wheelchair users. So participants are already kind of self-selecting before they even get to the point where they can be part of an audience study within a festival. And this goes to pretty much any sort of inclusive festival, no matter how inclusive a festival is trying to be. If it's within an arts center or a very kind of controlled place like that, you're automatically self-selecting. So we can look at works in the home. We could call this, in the wild. This could complement some of this other work done in labs or festivals. So there was a 2020 study by Ducasse, Clune, and Putzihar where they examined audience engagement with a 13-episode interactive web doc. It was a series called I-O-Talk, translated as I Island. And this series tells the story of 13 inhabitants on a small Croatian island. They analyzed 15,000 sessions. And they looked at different variables like gender, age, nationality, mostly Croatian and Slovenian. The device, 84% were on laptops. And it's really interesting that they were very instructive about the context that you should engage with this interactive documentary. They said it should be on a laptop. And of course, 16% of their naughty audiences watch them on mobiles. So our audience is always pushing, even as we're trying to control them within these studies, they're always pushing the boundaries, 16% using mobile phones. They also looked at the time of day that audiences engaged, and they found that actually most of it was during the daytime when people are at work. So it was really interesting to see where our audiences in the wild are engaging with interactive, particularly web docs in this case. But they also found that the more clicks there were, people would drop off. And so as we're instructing our audiences to click through, to the next bit of content, that there seems to be a bit of either frustration or boredom or just a feeling of a permission to leave and to terminate the experience there. The study is a useful reminder that more interactivity does not necessarily make a work more engaging. As interactive documentary naysayer Charles Forceville argues, all this clicking around, in fact, potentially confuses the audience and weakens the coherence of a maker's intent. In Forceville's view, multiple story routes and indeterminacy in the interface detract from the message of a work. That claim is partially supported actually by Kate Nash's studies, where audiences tended to experience stories that the maker did not entirely intend to tell. How does this happen? Well, this inevitable process where audiences given these elements, branching narratives and different pieces that they can kind of assemble together, will inevitably end up in different meanings that they make. Another research project, the Virtual Reality's Immersive Documentary Encounters, this one in the UK, was a study of VR at home. And the researchers gave VR headsets to 12 households over a 10-week period and asked them to record and reflect on their experiences of 360 documentaries. Participants at first enjoyed it. They found the content engaging and visceral, but they also noted this uneasiness with kind of feeling present and yet not being able to participate in whatever the story might be. And this is particularly true for very emotive content, such as being placed in a refugee camp. But their discomfort wasn't just the result of the storytelling style or content, it was also to do with the context. It was the fact that they were at home, on their sofas, in comfort, whilst watching this. And they didn't know how this kind of dissonance of how do you consider yourself at home in your comfort, just watching someone else almost as a voyeur in a refugee camp. So there was as soon as they kind of take off the headset, the kind of spell of enchantment of VR is broken, and the physical reality kind of comes crashing back down and exposes the artifice of the virtual. So there's an importance in the physical surroundings in which our audiences are engaging with interactive documentary. Now it's tempting to separate the psychological or kind of cognitive side of experiencing work from the physical side. This process of kind of clicking or searching around or reading or watching. But as Merleau-Ponty points out, this thinking is done through the body. In the Phenomenology of Perception, Merleau-Ponty writes that we do not have a body, as if it's an object, nor do we inhabit a body, as if some sort of consciousness implanted atop this walking, fleshy frame. He writes, "We are our bodies, and it is through these bodies that we synthesize all we see and touch. Through these bodies we know ourselves in relation to objects in the world." Now, Merleau-Ponty writes about space mostly in the abstract. It's not until what we can call the spatial turn of the humanities in the 90s and the sensory turn, a decade later, that we can see how scholars have better contextualized social phenomena and behaviors in relation to particular locations. So David Howes, for example, argues that the sensory turn in the humanities helps us to consider not just embodiment, but what he terms emplacement. How the place influences the experience of the mind and body. Quote, "The paradigm of embodiment implies an integration of mind and body. The emergent paradigm of emplacement suggests the sensuous interrelationship of mind, body, and environment." So adopting emplacement helps us to situate all these stimuli in relation to work. Picking up again on Judith Aston's work here, applying Howe's idea. Aston employs this term in-place interaction to examine physical and social context in which an audience experiences a work. As she explains, interactive documentaries are not experienced in a dislocated vacuum. Interactants engage with them in places like galleries, festivals, or at home, sometimes with others. So scholars ought to examine the social and physical context of an interactive documentary. So this next section, I'll be looking at a few examples, and it will build on and sort of complicate some of this concept of in-place interaction as I look at some of these complexities. So, when we do interactive documentaries, web docs in particular, we might have these instructions like, put on your headphones, press the button to continue, speak into the microphone. These are some of the commands that audiences might have when engaging with a work. But these instructions either suggest or demand that the audience exert some agency over the flow, physical elements, and sometimes the outcome of the work. So I'm going to break this down into a few different ways of thinking about the context. So first is the physical context. How, where, and on what devices our audiences engage. And I'm going to do what I tell my students not to do and put up a big chart of lots of text. If I can find my mouse. Okay, here we go, enjoy. I've sort of broken this down. This has kind of helped me to think of the typologies of the different types of devices. So down on the left side, I've kind of broken it down into devices. I have not considered kind of theatrical necessarily as a device, because I think these devices can be used in different types of performance and theatrical settings. But sort of thinking about, if we kind of center the devices here, thinking about the desktop, laptop, touch screens, mobile phones, then XR headsets, projection onto a wall, could be interactive or otherwise, and then all the other kind of miscellaneous kind of digital interfaces, game arcades, for example. And we can think of the different elements and then what this affords our audience. So when we're thinking about the design affordances as creators, what sort of behaviors do these encourage or allow or facilitate? And sometimes how do our audiences push that? I think it's always really, really interesting to study. So I've sort of, been thinking through maybe what are some of the spaces, but maybe some of the limitations, I suppose. But we have to keep in mind, especially in the main column there, what is the physical context? What are the physical actions that we are asking our audiences to do? But physical interaction is not always even clicking a button to progress the experience. Specifically, when we look at XR formats, when we look at Mandy Rose looks at how the literal physical act of looking, just spinning your head around, changing perspective, creates a form of montage within 360 film, for example. Now, sometimes we have these within a gallery or a festival context, and when you think about when you experience a work in that context, you have to deal with lots of annoyances, noise, discomfort, with a device, with a headset, cues, these competitively ticketed time slots. If you go into any experience hot, tired, irritated, hungry, it will require a lot of persuasion from a work to correct your mood. This is where a friendly host is necessary. So often at a festival or a gallery, they will have a trained docent who can help guide you through the experience, giving instructions, content warnings, help if something goes wrong, and guide you back out, this offboarding. That docent then becomes part of the experience, and they're sometimes even a part of the story itself. Now, they also help to give clues and help you to sometimes connect the dots if you don't get it yourself. It's not so convenient if you're doing something at home and you're completely lost, as I have been before. Now, we've also seen over the past decade initiatives to lower the barriers to access with interactive and immersive work and offer it in community and civic spaces, such as libraries, schools, and cinema spaces. There's also value in placing interactive and immersive work in open spaces, such as town squares. And so this is a piece that I've been working on since 2015. Oh, that is not what I wanted to do. I don't know where the mouse is. I've been a producer on a work since 2015 called A Mile in My Shoes. This has traveled around the world in this shipping container that looks like a shoebox. This invites an audience to come in. You can see all the rows of shoe boxes in the back. Try on some shoes that fit you, and then that pair of shoes is attached to a mini iPod audio player. And you can walk around for 10 minutes listening to someone's story. Now, I did some audience research on this and found that most of the audiences kind of came across this serendipitously. They didn't seek it out. This was not part of a festival. It was just plonked into their town center. And I asked the audiences about their physical reactions, about their journeys as they walked along in these shoes. And it was really interesting how some participants really focused on the shoes first and foremost, that the shoes were a key part of telling the story. They were kind of reading the shoes semiotically, of kind of like looking for signs and clues and signals to who the person was. And that went along with the device where you click play and walk around in. So we see this kind of interesting playing of, even though it's a linear audio piece, there's still that space for interactivity and for some sort of agency to be able to kind of create their own experience within a landscape. So this is it down the river, and that was in the middle of a housing estate in London. Now, if you look at some examples in the home, and this can also actually, you can listen to the podcast in the home, but I find that really boring because I really like the shoes. But we can look at some other interactive documentaries that take place both in galleries, but also available at home. There's a recent work called A Colonia Luxemburguesa. Apologies for my bad Portuguese. It's a Belgian-Brazilian co-production, and it takes place really over a couple of hours. And so it makes you wonder how much would you watch that in a gallery setting, especially if it's on a small screen and you feel like you have queues of people around you. So I actually watched it at home. I found that more enjoyable. I could watch it at my own pace. And I'd be really curious to speak to them about what sort of empirical audience studies they've done. Because what you can see is that when there are so many click-throughs, I wonder how much people do drop out. But it's a really interesting piece to kind of look at side by side between an at-home and an in-gallery sort of experience. Let me move on, because I'm looking at the time here, and kind of think a little bit about the social and cultural context. So where geographically and when is something being experienced? When we think about the cultural lens or past experiences of audiences, how that shapes the way that they make meaning in interactive documentary. I don't know if anyone knows the work of Laura Marks and this concept of haptic visuality. that audiences never just watch and cognitively process a film. The act of viewing a film involves physically reacting to the story on screen. Watching it is a process of feeling it in and through the body. The image and sound can resonate with the viewer's own life experiences, including joys and traumas, but also their cultural context. And so Marx especially looks at kind of the potential here for intercultural cinema, and how film made in one part of the world can speak sort of semi-universally, or at least to people in other places, and express the sort of humanity of the other on screen. Now we can see with interactive documentary, it's not just the visual, but sometimes the physical process that helps provide this bridge for intercultural connection. And so one of my favorite recent examples is this work from Australia called Ravi and Emma. It's a love story of a couple in Australia learning to communicate with each other through sign language. It's a story of how Emma meets Ravi and how they fall in love, and she begins to learn Southern dialect Australian Sign Language, or Auslan. And so the audience, when watching this, watch through these small clips, but in order to progress the story, you have to sign using the webcam on your browser. And that then recognizes that you're communicating that word, and then that clicks on to the next video. So it's a really nice way of forcing the audience to use their body and responding to the work, progressing the story along. But I think it's also an interesting illustration of that sort of Merleau-Ponty's idea of perception, that experience and knowledge is gained in the process of engaging the body. We can expand on this and say that actually physically acting out these signs it helps with this sort of creating a bridge or an understanding across a communication barrier. We can understand this experience as placed interaction. The interaction is meant to bridge the gap between the physical and social context of the audience. So I'm doing it in Europe. This is based on sign language in Australia. But experiencing media from another place doesn't always lead to intercultural understanding. That's kind of a nice ideal, isn't it? But we see from studies from the 90s, there was an anthropologist, Wilton Martinez, who did these studies with students, looking at ethnographic films. And what he found was that his students, over a few years, over these studies, his students would watch these ethnographic documentaries and still read otherness into it. They would still project onto it a primitiveness of the other. So rather than educating viewers, the film only further entrenched previously held views. So documentaries don't always necessarily create this lovely intercultural exchange or understanding. Sometimes the barriers are still there. And I think Kate Nash's work in looking at interactive documentary also backs up this somewhat, in that the audience is really, as they're choosing their own direction, they're going to make their own connections and they're going to make their own meanings, which might be quite different from what the maker was hoping. We can also look at historical context of documentaries. I'll give a couple examples here of like 18 Days in Egypt, Fort McMoney, Gaza Sderot. I mean, some of the classics you can no longer watch because they were all built in Flash. But the context, if you could watch them, and you can get some playthroughs online. I also wonder, they were very urgent at the time that they were made, but how relevant are they for audiences now, growing up in a world of polycrisis and continual climate breakdown and new conflicts? Do these works still have the same power that they might have held a decade ago? So I do wonder the kind of longevity of some of these pieces that are very kind of issues-based within a time. When we look at the MIT DocuBase, it's a wonderful mausoleum for all these great works that were once alive, but are now sadly a bit dead. And I appreciate our eulogy yesterday for WebDocs. But just in my last minute, I also wanted to look at what it is to be a maker. Again, sorry, finding my mouse. There we go. And this was Through the Wardrobe. Now, it was a room scale augmented reality installation where the audience comes in, they choose an item of clothing. You can see a rail there. This was at home in Manchester. down here. Up there was in Beijing. So the audience come in, they choose an item of clothing, something that catches their eye. The item of clothing has a tag, and then they're instructed to put on a headset. It's a Microsoft HoloLens. That headset reads the tag, and then a bunch of bubbles kind of appear in front of you within the room. And then it's up to you to explore the room, the objects in the room, and as you walk into each bubble, a new chapter appears. And it's 4 different stories of people who are all non-binary, trans, from Bristol, where I was living. I made the project over a number of years within the community in Bristol. But when I first tested this with my audiences, I didn't give them instructions. I wanted to see what do they need in order to know. I didn't want to instruct them how to use their bodies. I said, here's a headset, off you go. Tell me at the end what you wish you knew. And that's how I did my user testing. I then iterated it with each exhibition. So even with my live audiences, when it was out in the world, when they would come back, I would then tweak it just a little bit, maybe clarify something or take away an instruction. And so I started to kind of, it was a very live project as it went on from one place to the next. Now, I had terrific fun with this, especially in the last interaction with it, the last exhibition, which was in the back of a nightclub. And I think this, for me, kind of engaging with an audience that is already out using their bodies, raving in a nightclub, then to come through into the back, it was kind of like, Alice kind of tumbling down the rabbit hole, coming in and experiencing the work was actually, I think, one of the greatest joys of putting this on. And the reactions from audiences of, why is there an experience like this in the back of a nightclub? But it's kind of a provocation of, is this a way, as we're talking about, the death of interactive documentary, is this a possible way of looking at other places of opening up rather than closing down, of thriving, not just surviving or dying, for some of our work, as we consider audiences, the way that they use their bodies, accessibility, a lot of these kind of themes that I've looked at along the way. So thank you.